is Anna with Folksy Tales. I decided to go ahead and just give you my name because it feels weird just saying, hi, this is Folksy Tales. So, hi, this is Anna with Folksy Tales. I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's viewed my videos in the past couple days, past week or so. The growth is phenomenal, and I know most of it is coming from the juniper tree, and I had so much fun making that video despite the, subject matter. So I'm just so happy and honored, honestly, that so many people are showing an interest. And a deep thank you to those of you who have subscribed. It means more than I think I can express. I don't know what to say other than thank you. And also a thank you from this little guy here. I know that that video would not have blown up without him just being himself. He is currently napping, and I was going to, bring him over to say hello, but if I try to move him from his little loaf position, he will be very grumpy and probably bite me. You can't see it, but he's already scratched me up a little bit for trying to disturb him, which is why I'm wearing something that covers my shoulders right now. So thank you from me, from the little, oh yeah, now he's showing his back. That's a way to be grateful. What can you do? He's a cat. They don't know how to do gratitude. So with that being said, I already knew I was going to film this story as a thank you when I got to 1,000. I thought that would be more like November and not now, but I fast-tracked it. So here we go. This is the story, The Shadow, by Hans Christen Anderson. This is an eerie story that was published as a part of the collection New Fairy Tales in 1847. But is it really a fairy tale? Once upon a time, there was a man from a cold land that decided to go to a very hot land, a place where the sun burns. However, when he came to this place, he soon learned that he and other sensible folks had to close all the windows and hide inside all day long to avoid the bright, scorching sunshine. It wasn't long before this man, who was a very learned man, he was known as a scholar, and that's what I will call him, the scholar. The scholar started to really suffer with this lifestyle of staying inside all day and only really coming out at night. He began to lose weight and become ill, and even his shadow started to become thin. Now at night, in this place where he now lived, people would come alive. They would go out on their balconies, they would talk and meet, go to restaurants, hold all sorts of events like weddings and funerals. It's the only time really that they could come outside. And all of this was done under the light of thousands and thousands of candles. Now on the street where the scholar lived, there were many houses all pressed together, and only one of these houses was always quiet. There were flowers growing in baskets on the windowsill, and in the evening, people could hear music coming from inside. Everyone knew someone lived there, but no one had ever seen them. The landlord of the scholar told him, when he asked, that no one knew who owned the house, and every night it seemed like it was the same piece of music that people would hear outside. It seemed almost like someone was trying over and over again to master that piece of music, but they could never quite get it right. Now one night, it just so happened that the scholar happened to wake up and look out his open window. In the flower basket of the house opposite him, he saw a strange light. It almost seemed like the flowers were on fire, each of them flaming with a different color, so bright that it was difficult to look at. And in the center of that fire was a woman, and she was shining so bright that it hurt his eyes to look at her. The man snuck out of bed and crept up to his window, but by the time he could look out again, she was gone. The door to the balcony of the house was wide open, and somewhere from deep inside the dark house, the man could hear an enchanting melody. It was such a beautiful sound that it seemed almost like magic. Once again, the scholar wondered who lived in this strange house, why no one ever saw them. Now one evening it happened that the scholar was sitting out on his balcony with the light of his room shining behind him. Because of this, his shadow was cast out onto the building in front of him. Looking at the shadow of himself, he jokingly made a comment that His shadow was the only one that seemed to be living in that house. He said that his shadow looked lovely and right at home amongst those beautiful flowers, and jokingly commanded it to go inside and investigate, to figure out who lived in this strange house, and then return to him. Then the man stood up from where he sat, and of course his shadow rose with him. But when the man turned around to go back inside, his shadow turned around and went into the strange house. The next morning, the scholar went out to enjoy his coffee and read a newspaper out on his balcony before the sun became too hot. And almost immediately when he stepped out into the light, he realized he had no shadow. And instead of being terrified, the man was just annoyed that his shadow had not returned to him. And he was even more annoyed that this had happened to him, because he knew of a story in the cold land from where he came of a man who had no shadow. And as a writer, the scholar thought to himself, if I was to write about this strange thing that has happened to me, everyone back home will think I copied this other man. So this isn't an original thing to have happened. How irritating. That evening, he sat back down where he had the other night, with his light behind him, and he waited and waited, then commanded for his shadow to return. But it didn't. However, within 8 days, a new shadow had begun to grow, and after 3 more weeks, the shadow had grown lovely and full. And so he decided it was time to return home to the cold land. And during his journey, the shadow continued to develop until it was as it should be. Now, when the scholar returned home, he wrote books about all that he had seen and experienced. He wrote all about what was good and what was beautiful and what was true. Years passed, and he continued in his comfortable life, earning an income as a writer. One evening, he was at home when someone knocked on his door. When the scholar went to open it, he found a very thin but finely dressed man standing in his doorway. This stranger was dressed as a fine gentleman, and the scholar asked who he was and why he was there. I have got so much body, said the fine man. I have even got flesh and clothes. You certainly never thought of seeing me so well off. Do you not know your old shadow? The shadow continued, saying that in their years apart he had become a very well-off and fine gentleman, and now he had returned to his old master to purchase his service, so that no debt lay between them. He showed off his valuables, the seals on his watch, the golden chain on his neck, and the diamonds on the rings on his fingers. The scholar was too shocked, understandably, to really react, and he just demanded to know what on earth was happening. And the shadow responded that, well, the scholar had told him to go off, and so the shadow had gone to do his own thing. But he wanted to come back and see the scholar again before the scholar became too old, and he also wanted to see the cold lands again. After all, he had grown up there with the scholar. Then the shadow pointed out that the scholar had grown a new shadow, and he asked again if the scholar wanted any kind of sum or purchase of service so that no debt would remain between them. The scholar was still very confused and not really accepting that his shadow was now what appeared to be a man. But the shadow started to get angry and demanded to know if the scholar was owed any debt. And finally, the scholar accepted that this was his shadow come back to him, and he said that there was no debt. His old shadow owed him nothing, but he wanted to hear the story of what had happened in their years apart. How had this come to be? The shadow responded that he would tell the story. He would tell his old master everything that had happened, but only if the scholar promised to never tell anyone that the shadow was once a shadow. And the scholar said that he would keep this promise. He gave his word that he would never tell anyone, and a man is as good as his word. The shadow responded, and a word is as good as its shadow. Once again, the scholar was amazed at just how much like a fine gentleman his shadow appeared to be. His clothes were made of the finest materials, the finest fabrics. His shoes were a glossy patent leather, and he had a fine hat fit for the opera. As he watched, his old shadow began to tap and grind his glossy new shoes over the scholar's new shadow. Maybe this was a sign of superiority or arrogance. Maybe he was trying to force the new shadow to stick to his own feet. The scholar wasn't sure. As for his new shadow, it was listening carefully, hoping to learn some trick or way in which he might also become free and become his own man, like the old shadow. And so the shadow began his story. He told the scholar that the person who lived in the strange house opposite theirs, down in the hot lands, was Poetry herself. By staying in her home for a couple of weeks, the shadow was able to learn everything there was to know. The scholar became excited, saying that he knew sometimes Poetry would live as a hermit in big cities surrounded by people. He asked to know specifically, where had the shadow gone? What had he seen from the moment he appeared in the house across the street? The shadow responded that he had gone in through the balcony, through the door. When he came into the house, the room he entered was dark, but outside were brightly lit halls that he could not enter, or else he would disappear. And Poetry herself was much further into the house, but he couldn't get to her because of the light. The scholar pressed for details, asking his old friend to tell him everything that he had seen, but the shadow corrected him. He said that it wasn't proper to call him an old friend, for now the shadow was a wealthy, fine gentleman. The scholar apologized, saying that the term was an old habit, and asked the dear sir to continue his story. Again, the shadow responded that he had seen everything there was. He knew everything. And still the scholar pressed for details. What had he seen specifically? A temple, a forest, the open night sky. What? The shadow responded, everything. Everything was there in the court of Poetry. Although he had never left the dark anteroom, he had seen everything. But what did you see? The man asked. Gods? Heroes? The shadow said he had seen it all. And from what he had seen and learned there, he began to understand himself and what he was. When he was a part of the scholar, he hadn't had such deep thoughts. But once the shadow was on his own and was able to learn all of these new things, he thought about the times that the scholar would sit on the balcony and the shadow would be projected, how much larger he would be than the scholar himself. And at night, in the light of the moon, it almost seemed as though the shadow was more real than the scholar. And so the shadow had realized that what he truly was a man. And with that knowledge, he had left the court of Poetry and come back outside, only to find that the scholar was gone. Realizing he was alone, the shadow became embarrassed because he had no trappings of a man. He had nothing to show what he was. He had no clothes, he had no flesh, no finery. And so he rushed forward, but he told the scholar, "You are not to repeat this. Do not tell anyone that I hid." But I did hide. I hid under the skirts of the cake woman, and there I waited until evening without her knowing. And once evening came, the shadow came out and stretched up onto the sides of buildings, and it felt almost as though he was relieving a great itch. He was able to spread out and be free. And with this newfound freedom, he peered into all the windows that he could. He saw all of the things that men and women did behind closed doors, things that they didn't want anyone else to know or to witness, the way they treated one another, their children, the things they said, and all of the wickedness that people tried to hide. He told the scholar that if he had chosen to write about all the things he saw in the newspaper, it would have been very popular. But he decided not to do that. Instead, the shadow wrote directly to the people he observed of what he saw. He traveled from place to place doing this, and everywhere he went, there was a great fear and anxiety that followed him. But people also loved him, and they gave him everything he wanted. Local professors named him as a professor. The local banks printed him new money, tailors gave him clothes, and all the women told him how handsome he was. And it was through all of this that he became the fine man that he knew he was. And with this, the shadow told the scholar that his story was over. He gave the scholar his calling card, told him that he was always home on rainy days, and the shadow left. Years passed, and the shadow came again to visit the scholar. He asked the scholar how life was going, but life wasn't going very well for the scholar. His life's work was to write about all things that were good and true and beautiful, but it seemed more and more to him that no one cared about those things. People were not interested in reading what he wrote, and it was beginning to weigh heavily on him. The shadow responded that these kinds of things didn't weigh heavily on him. They shouldn't bother the scholar either. Then he suggested that maybe if the scholar were to travel, it would improve his health. In fact, the shadow already had a trip planned, and he would pay for the scholar to join him as his shadow. The scholar was shocked and said that this suggestion was inappropriate. It was not right. But the shadow just shrugged and said that right, wrong, depends how you look at it. And again, he suggested the scholar really ought to travel. It would be good for him. The shadow would pay, as long as the scholar was his shadow. Now the scholar was truly upset. He told the shadow that this was just not right. This had gone too far. The shadow again just shrugged and said, just the way it is, and it's the way it's going to continue to be. Time continued to pass, and the scholar became more and more despondent, more upset. He was full of sadness, and trouble just seemed to follow him. His writing wasn't selling. People just didn't seem to care about what he had to say, about things that were good and beautiful and true. And in time, he grew ill and frail. People began telling him that he seemed to be like a shadow. And again, the shadow came to visit. When he saw the state of the scholar, he said the scholar really needed to go to a watering place to improve his health. And it just so happened the shadow was already going to a watering place because he was having trouble growing his beard and thought that it might help. And so he invited the scholar to come with him, to come as his friend, his companion. He would pay for everything. And this time, the scholar agreed. As they went out on their journey, the shadow planned everything. He led the way. He acted as the master and dictated what the scholar did, even where he walked. They would move either side by side or one before the other, depending on the position of the sun. It didn't seem odd to the scholar, or at least he didn't comment. He was innocent and kind at heart. It didn't really bother him to be told what to do. And one day, as they were in their travels, he told the shadow that since they were such old friends and they had been together for so many years, they should refer to one another by their first names, that it would show how good of friends they were. And the shadow responded that this was a fantastic idea, but there was just one thing. He told the scholar, there are some people that they touch a certain type of gray paper and it makes them shudder. There are some people that hear the sound of nails on glass and they just can't stand it. It makes them feel sickened and just, ugh. The shadow had the same problem, but his issue was hearing the scholar call his first name. It just made him feel so unwell. He couldn't bear to have the scholar call his first name. But the shadow would happily call the scholar by his first name. In fact, yes, that was a good compromise, the shadow decided. I shall call you by your first name, you shall call me by my last name. There we go. And the scholar was irritated by this, thinking, that seems unfair. Why should you use my first name, but I must still call you Mr. Shadow, which is how I will now refer to him for clarity, Mr. Shadow. But again, the scholar decided that there was nothing to be done about it, and he just accepted it. Finally, they reached the watering place. It was very busy there, and among those taking the waters was a lovely young princess whose ailment was that she saw things a little too clearly. And this was very upsetting, although I'm not sure who it was upsetting to, her or people around her. Regardless, it was seen as some sort of illness to be treated, and so she was also at the watering place. Now, because of this illness, the princess immediately noticed when the scholar and the shadow arrived and saw that there was something very different about the shadow. He was like no one else. She learned that he was there in hopes of growing a beard. But as she was interested, and as a royal who did not necessarily need to stand on ceremony, one day she decided to just go straight up to Mr. Shadow and tell him, "Your problem is that you cannot cast a shadow." And he turned to her saying, "Well, princess, I have heard that you are here because you see things too clearly. And I'm happy to say that you must be getting better because you do not see me clearly. I do have a shadow. That man that is always following me around, that is my shadow. I am such a wealthy, fine gentleman that I have been able to set my own shadow up with flesh and clothing, and even pay, although it is very expensive, for him to have his very own shadow. I just enjoy unique things, you see, so that man, that is my shadow." The princess was delighted to hear that she may be getting better, and fascinated by this unusual man. That night, Mr. Shadow and the princess danced together, and she found that he was the most phenomenal dancer, so light on his feet. And as they danced, they began to talk to one another. And it just so happened that when Mr. Shadow learned where the princess came from, he found that he had been to that country. He had been there while she was away. It had been one of the places that he had peeped into windows, and so he knew a great deal about her people. When she would talk about her country and bring up topics and different ideas, he would have great advice and insight and wisdom to share with her. And she was amazed that he knew so much about her country and the world in general. And to her, he seemed like an incredibly wise man. And as they talked and danced, she began to fall in love with him. But she had to think of her people, of her country, of her position. And so she decided that she needed to test him a little further to make sure that what he knew wasn't just superficial knowledge about her country and about the world. And in her eyes, he saw that she was falling in love with him, and he was determined to hold her interest. But when she asked her deep and philosophical questions, he couldn't answer her. When she asked him about this, he responded that, "Oh, all of these answers, they were things I would have been able to tell you when I was young, but, now, not sure. You should go ask my shadow. He's over there in the doorway. He's been with me my whole life, and I'm sure he's heard me say," please ignore the fact that Captain is now actively grooming himself behind me. Sorry about that. Because the shadow had been with him his whole life, he would have heard everything that Mr. Shadow had said and would be able to answer her questions. But he told her, "If my shadow is to answer you, you must treat him as though he were a man. He is very proud, you see. And if you do not treat him as if he were a human, he will not be able to answer any of your questions." And so, intrigued by the idea of a shadow speaking to her, the princess went over to the scholar in the doorway, and she asked her deep philosophical questions, to which he was able to answer. He spoke to her about the elements, about nature, and about the deep inner thoughts and workings of man, about how some men are different on the outside from what they really are on the inside. And the princess was amazed. My handsome stranger is so intelligent that even his shadow is wise. And so the princess decided that marrying the stranger would be a good thing for her country. It would be an asset. He would bring great wisdom and knowledge to her people. So she went back to him and they devised a plan. But Mr. Shadow told her, "No one is to know of our plan until we reach your country. Not even my shadow can know." And she agreed. And so the three of them traveled back to her country. And no sooner had they arrived than the shadow told the scholar they needed to talk. Mr. Shadow said that now he was a happy and healthy man, and he was in a good position to offer the scholar a great opportunity. He told the scholar that he would be able to live in the great palace and have a salary of $100,000 a year. All he had to do was pretend to be Mr. Shadow's shadow. He had to allow everyone to refer to him as a shadow, and he had to never tell anyone the truth. And once a year, Mr. Shadow would sit out in the warm sunlight on his balcony, at which time the scholar must lay on the floor at his feet. Then Mr. Shadow told the scholar that all of this would be possible because Mr. Shadow was marrying the princess that very night. The scholar was horrified and outraged. He said that he would not do this. He would never do this. And that he would go now and tell everyone the truth, that it was really Mr. Shadow who was a shadow, pretending to be a man. The scholar himself was the real man. Mr. Shadow had been lying to everyone. But Mr. Shadow was calm, and he said, "Calm down now. Don't be ridiculous. No one will believe you. Just be reasonable. Do what I ask." Again, the scholar refused. He said he would go straight to the princess and tell her the truth. But Mr. Shadow simply said, "I'll get there first." And he did, because the guards knew Mr. Shadow as the princess's fiancé. They did not know the scholar, and the scholar was taken to prison. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Shadow went to the princess, and he was shaky and upset. And the princess went to him saying that she hoped he wasn't ill. He didn't want to be sick for their wedding night. He responded that no, he wasn't ill, but he had just seen a terrible thing. His shadow had gone mad, declaring that he was a man and that Mr. Shadow was a shadow. It was such a horrifying sight to see, and he just couldn't believe it had happened. And the princess was deeply upset, telling him that she hoped he was all right, asking if the shadow had been taken to prison. Mr. Shadow responded that yes, of course, his shadow was in prison, and unfortunately it seemed that he just wasn't going to recover. At this time, it seemed there was only one last thing to do, a final kindness he could bestow on his poor shadow. He should be put out of his misery. And the princess agreed, saying it was a terrible tragedy and that Mr. Shadow was such a noble man for having the strength to do this. That night, they had a great wedding. The entire city was lit up with great lights, and crowds gathered in the streets to cheer as Mr. Shadow and the princess stood out on the balcony, waving to their people. The scholar, however, never heard word of this beautiful wedding, for he had already been executed. And that is the tale of the shadow. I have so many thoughts on this one, honestly. Reading through it, I was practically screaming at my computer every time there was that bit of foreshadowing. And I hadn't read this story before, but I just knew. I knew that it was going to be terrible. I didn't know that he was going to die. That, I have to say, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. This story has been made into many different adaptations. It has been made into movies, comics, novels, songs, an opera, a radio program, and a ballet. And this tale, coming from Hans Christen Anderson, is a story that honestly reminded me more of an Edgar Allan Poe story. The dark themes, the foreshadowing. Captain, I see you. It's unlike any other story that says it's a fairy tale that I've ever read. And we'll talk a little bit about what a fairy tale is in just a second, see if we can figure out if this even is a fairy tale. Now, Hans Christen Andersen has written his fair share of dark fairy tales. The original Little Mermaid she dies. The little match girl, oh, that's a sad story. She dies. And there are others. It's not like this is his first dark story, but this is also the same author that gave us The Ugly Duckling, Thumbelina, The Wild Swans. Oh, one of my favorites. In case you want to watch it. So he's also written his fair share of happy endings. So let's start with, what is a fairy tale? And there's no exact definition of what a fairy tale is. Typically, there are just a number of characteristics, and it's one of those things where typically if you read a story that feels like a fairy tale, it probably is. A lot of definitions I saw simply called fairy tales a wondrous tale directed at children, which I thought is a way too broad scope. And so I found more specific characteristics that are typically associated with fairy tales. And although not every fairy tale has every characteristic, it's a pretty good place to start. So the characteristics of fairy tales would be a set opening phrase and ending phrase. For example, once upon a time, they lived happily ever after. They're also stories that are typically from an oral tradition, meaning they were passed around by word of mouth for a long, long time before they were ever written down. Fairy tales also typically contain character archetypes, so the hero, the villain, the mentor, all that fun stuff. They typically feature repetition, whether that be in just repeating phrases or groupings of things, like groupings of three. Typically have some sort of element of wondrous magic or other fantastical part to them. And there's always either a problem to solve or a lesson to learn. With those parameters, I don't really consider this to be a fairy tale. At first, I saw this as a cautionary tale, which is the type of folktale that warns the listener of a danger. But then I thought more about it, and typically cautionary tales have a very explicit, clear, tangible danger. And by that, I mean, person gets told not to do something, they do the thing, bad thing happens. That's typically a cautionary tale. Whereas in this case, it's much more insidious. It's much sneakier. The darkness and the danger is, oh, it's so creepy. It's not quite like a typical cautionary tale either. So I still haven't made my mind up as to what I personally would categorize this as. Let me know what you think. I'm so curious. The one thing though I would say with some confidence is this story is a metaphor. Now, what you think it's a metaphor for, I guess, might depend on how you see the shadow in the scholar. I see it as a metaphor of the danger of giving too much of yourself over to a darkness, a dark side of you. And shadows typically in fairy tales and other literature are seen as being the dark side of the subconscious, like your dark half. It's like a doppelganger. Talk about that in a second. I see it as kind of a warning about the danger of allowing darkness to take over too much. The scholar gives over first his name. He allows the shadow to call him by his first name, but then the shadow insists on only going by his last name. So he gives up the control over what he's called in terms of respect. And then he gives up so much of his autonomy. He allows the shadow to direct where he moves and where he stands. And then he just follows the shadow along and doesn't really look deeper into things until it's too late. And then he finds that he has no power, no autonomy. The shadow has taken everything, and the scholar loses his life. It could also be a metaphor against materialism, as other people who have read this story have pointed out, that the shadow gets everything he wants through physical means. And oh, I had a shiver the first time I read it when I realized that he was blackmailing people to get everything that he wanted, that he was sending letters to people about what he literally saw through their windows, and then saying it as if everyone adored him and just gave him everything he deserved. It's so manipulative and insidious and just creepy that, And then there's the scholar who is completely on the other side. He lives for writing about things that are good and wholesome and full of beauty and truth, but no one seems to care. And that saddens him greatly. Whereas the shadow only cares about things that he can physically have. And that's what I mean when I say the dangers of just giving into materialism, that the evil of materialism takes over what is right in the end. And again, the scholar loses his life. It's such a tragic story. While I was reading this as well, one of the first things that came to mind is that the shadow is like a doppelganger. And although it doesn't say the shadow looks exactly like the scholar, in fact, I would think they don't look exactly alike, or someone probably would have said something like, is that your twin? You know, the princess doesn't comment on that. But we know that they are literally like two halves of the same whole. The shadow is like the scholar's dark side. And that's what a doppelganger in some contexts is. Doppelganger is a German word that literally means double walker. In the past, a doppelganger was seen as something like a death omen or a warning spirit, that if you saw your own doppelganger, it meant you were going to die. But in more recent times, a doppelganger is just seen as an evil side or an evil copy of you. Think of, there was a movie with Sophie Turner about a doppelganger. Elena from Vampire Diaries, her doppelganger is Catherine. Doppelgangers, dark doubles, they are rampant in especially horror, but just in general. There's something so deeply unsettling about having a dark, evil version of you, something that looks exactly like you, but is bad. And as the reader, seeing the things kind of stack up and seeing the shadow test the waters of manipulation and start by suggesting that the scholar be a shadow and then backing off because the scholar freaks out, and then positioning the scholar into moving like a shadow, having him walk next to, beside, in front, and then finally in the end demanding that the scholar become his shadow, and when he refuses, having the scholar executed. It's just so, well, I've said it before, it's just creepy. It's creepy, it's creepy. So unsettling. I will resist the temptation to go full literature analysis on you, but there is just one thing that I have to share with you because it was just such a good take. I just have to, in case there's a solitary literature nerd among you who would find this interesting. There is an article called A Man, a Word, Hans Christen Andersen's The Shadow by Hans Henrik Mahler. It's Danish. I apologize if I said that wrong. But Mahler gives his interpretation over the part of the story where the scholar says a man is as good as his word, and the shadow responds, and a word is as good as its shadow. What Mahler says is that in this moment, the scholar is a word. He is his words. He's a writer. His words are what matter to him. And his words are always about what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. That's what he cares about. But words aren't real. And this may get a little too woo-woo for you, but I agree with Mahler. Words are just constructs. They're not real. You can't touch a word. And in that way, a word is almost a shadow of what it is describing. So in a way, the scholar is completely consumed by things that aren't real. His thoughts about the world and what he thinks is good. And he really should just be concerned with the things that are real, the things that he can see and touch and do and experience. And that's essentially why he loses himself to the shadow. But I will leave it at that because I'm not going to just start ranting about philosophy. This is a story channel. But with all that being said, and a lot of my scattered thoughts and just a whole lot of me reiterating how creepy I found this story, I really want to know what you think. I think there is so much room for dialogue about this, about how people interpret this story, about what people think that it means, about how it makes them feel. I want to know, did you also get super creeped out? Did you see the little steps leading towards what inevitably was going to be a bad ending for the scholar. I held out hope for the longest time that he was going to, get back in control. He was going to vanquish his shadow. Maybe he was going to bring some bright light to do away with the shadow, but it didn't happen. It was far too, dare I say, realistic, the ending. And as someone who likes to read fairy tales because they're fantastical, don't give me that realism about how terrible the world can be. That's not why I'm here. But that's also part of the reason I found this story so fascinating and why I chose to talk about it today. I hope you enjoyed this story. I hope you either learned something or just enjoyed my telling and my scattered thoughts about how I felt. Thank you again so much for watching these videos, for subscribing. It means more than I can say. And Captain also says thank you. Now that he is no longer sleeping and snoozing, I can bring him over without fear of him being grumpy. There he is. Captain also says thank you so much for subscribing. He appreciates you being here too. I know he wasn't super active in this one. I can't always promise that he will be, just that he does not like to leave this room when I film, and sometimes he likes to be involved. And now he is staring right into my ring light and blinding himself. Thank you for spending some time with me here today, and I will see you on Friday when I have the Japanese tale, the bamboo cutter, and the moonchild. I'll see you then.